Welcome back to the channel. If you love stories about ordinary people finding something extraordinary in the quiet corners of their lives, this one is for you. If stories like this move you, consider following along for more. Now, let's begin. Esther Calloway packed her whole life into 4 cardboard boxes and a duffel bag, and she did it in under an hour. Because if she stopped moving, she was afraid she would sit down on the floor of her childhood bedroom and never get up again. Her stepfather had given her exactly 1 week, spoken in the flat, reasonable tone he used for everything, the same tone he'd used to tell her mother he was tired of paying for a grown woman's mistakes. Esther was 22. Her mistake, as far as she could tell, was being born to a father who died before she could remember his face, and then trusting that the house she grew up in would always have room for her. She didn't argue. She had learned young that arguing with Richard only extended the conversation, never changed its outcome. She said goodbye to her mother in the driveway, and her mother cried in the specific, apologetic way of someone who had already decided not to intervene, and Esther drove north with the radio off because she didn't trust her voice not to crack along with the music. She had $11,000, saved from 6 years of double shifts at a diner outside Bellhaven, money she'd meant to use for community college, or a car that didn't stall on hills, or some vague, comfortable future she'd never let herself picture too clearly. Instead, she found herself scrolling a county auction site at a rest stop off Route 9, looking at a listing that made no sense to want as badly as she wanted it. A 1-room ranger cabin, decommissioned decades ago, sitting on 4 acres at the edge of Whistler Ridge State Forest, sold as is, no utilities, no guarantees. The photos showed a structure the color of old teeth, windows boarded, roof sagging on one side like a shoulder giving up. The listing said it had last been occupied in 1987. Something about that number caught in her chest, though she couldn't have said why. She placed a bid before she'd finished her coffee. 3 weeks later, she stood in front of the cabin holding a key that didn't quite fit the lock, working it in slow half-turns until the mechanism gave with a groan that sounded almost human. The forest around her was loud in the way forests are when people stop pretending they're silent, full of insects and wind moving through high branches and somewhere, water running over stone. She pushed the door open onto a room thick with dust and the particular smell of a house that has been holding its breath. There was a cot frame with no mattress, a wood stove furred with rust, a shelf of swollen paperbacks, and in the corner, half hidden beneath a collapsed section of ceiling insulation, a metal footlocker, padlocked, with a name stenciled on its lid in flaking white paint. A name that was not a stranger's. A name that was, impossibly, her own. Esther stood very still for longer than she meant to, staring at 4 stenciled letters that made no sense in this context. E-S-T-E-R, not a common spelling. Her mother had told her once, almost apologetically, that she'd been named after a great aunt nobody talked about, a woman who'd left the family young and never came back. Esther had always pictured someone glamorous, scandalous, the kind of relative who runs off to a city and reinvents herself. Not someone whose name ended up painted on a footlocker in an abandoned ranger cabin 4 hours from anywhere. She knelt down, brushed the dust away with her sleeve, and found the padlock rusted solid, the kind of rust that comes from decades, not years. She didn't have tools with her, only the small pry bar she'd packed for prying open old windows, and it took nearly 20 minutes of patient, careful leverage before the hasp finally snapped. Inside, the footlocker held what looked at first like nothing worth the effort. A ranger's uniform jacket, moth-eaten at the collar. A tin box of fishing lures gone brittle with rust. A stack of paperback westerns with cracked spines. And beneath all of it, wrapped in a plastic bag that had somehow kept its seal, a logbook, its cover embossed with the State Forestry Service emblem, its pages swollen but intact. Esther carried it out onto the sagging porch steps because the light was better there, and because something in her didn't want to read it inside that room, under that ceiling, in that silence. The first entries were mundane, dated 1979, written in a small, careful hand that logged weather, trail conditions, wildlife sightings, the ordinary rhythm of a man doing a quiet job in a quiet place. The ranger signed his entries simply as W. Calloway. Calloway, her mother's maiden name, the name Esther herself still carried since her mother had never bothered changing it after 2 divorces. She sat with that fact for a while, turning it over, telling herself that Calloway wasn't rare enough to mean anything. Plenty of Calloways in this state. She kept reading anyway, skimming forward through years of entries, watching the handwriting stay steady and unremarkable until she reached a date in March of 1987, where the entries suddenly stopped being about weather at all. The ranger had started writing about a woman, not romantically, not at first, more like a man documenting something he didn't fully understand, the way he might log an unusual animal track. She comes again today, he'd written, same as last month. Waits by the creek until dark, doesn't come to the door. I leave food on the stump, she takes it. I don't think she wants to be seen yet. Esther read that line 3 times. She turned the page and found a folded photograph tucked into the binding, its edges soft with age, showing a young woman standing at the tree line, her face turned half away from the camera, her posture the exact, unmistakable posture of someone who has learned not to be looked at directly. Esther didn't recognize the face, but she recognized the stance. She had seen it every morning of her life, in her own mother's reflection. The resemblance unsettled her more than any name could have. She'd grown up watching her mother stand exactly that way in doorways, in kitchens, in the driveway the day Esther left, half-turned, always ready to disappear if the moment required it. Esther folded the photograph back into the logbook and kept reading, because stopping now felt impossible. The entries through that spring grew longer, more personal, the ranger's handwriting loosening as though he were writing to someone rather than simply recording facts. He wrote about leaving warmer blankets near the creek in April, about the woman finally speaking to him in May. 3 words exchanged across 20 feet of water, though he never recorded what they were. He wrote, I think she is running from someone, and I think I am the only person she has told this to without saying it. By June, the entries mentioned a name. Not the woman's name, but a child's. He wrote, she has a daughter somewhere, left with family, she says, until she can make it safe to bring her. Esther's hands went cold reading that line. Her mother had told her, exactly once, in the flat voice reserved for topics she didn't want followed up, that she'd spent part of her own childhood living with an aunt while her mother, Esther's grandmother, worked away from home. Esther had never questioned it. Children stayed with relatives. It wasn't strange until it was sitting in front of her in a dead man's handwriting, wrapped in the specific, deliberate word, safe. She kept reading. The entries continued through that summer, warmer now, almost tender, the ranger describing small kindnesses, a fixed shoe, a shared meal, a woman slowly stepping out of the tree line and into daylight. And then, in August of 1987, the handwriting changed. It grew smaller, tighter, the letters pressed hard enough into the page that Esther could feel the indentation with her fingertip. Fire came through the eastern ridge last night, he'd written. Started at the old Denbroke lumber camp, moved faster than any of us predicted. I got the woman out. I did not get back in time for anything else. The logbook page after that was blank. Not torn out, not water damaged, simply blank, as though the man had opened to write and found he had nothing left to say. Esther sat on the porch steps as the light thinned toward evening, the forest around her settling into that particular hush that comes before dark, and she understood, with the sick clarity of something the body knows before the mind agrees to it, that this fire was not a detail. This fire was the reason nobody talked about the great aunt who left. This fire was the reason her mother had grown up with relatives instead of a mother. This fire, whatever it had taken, was the reason a footlocker with her own name on it had been locked shut and left in a cabin for 39 years, waiting, apparently, for her specifically to come and open it. Esther didn't sleep that night. She dragged the cot mattress she'd brought from her car into the cabin, lit a camp lantern, and read the logbook through twice more, searching for anything she'd missed, some sentence that would explain rather than deepen the mystery. There was nothing else in the ranger's hand, but tucked into the very back cover, she found a second document, folded into quarters, brittle enough that she had to open it with the flat of her palm instead of her fingers. It was a letter, not a log entry, written in a different hand entirely, looser, more slanted, clearly a woman's writing. It had no date. It began, "To whoever finds this, because W, and won't let me leave it any other way. My name was Esther Calloway before I made myself into someone else. I am writing this because the fire took the only proof I had that I existed before I became careful." Esther's own name, in a stranger's handwriting, describing herself in the past tense. She read on, her hands shaking now, not from cold. The letter explained, in fragments, what the logbook had only hinted at. The woman had left a marriage in another state, one she described only as one I could not stay inside of and survive, taking nothing with her but a daughter she was forced to leave behind with an aunt because a woman traveling with a child was too easy to trace. She had hidden in the forest for months, living on the edge of a ranger's territory, trusting almost no one, until the night of the fire, when the ranger she called only W carried her out through smoke thick enough to blind, and lost, in doing so, both of his legs from the knee down under a collapsed beam he never told anyone about, because by then there was no one left checking on an old ranger living alone at the edge of a burned forest. The letter said she stayed with him after that, not out of debt, but because somewhere in those months of silence and stumps of food left by a creek, she had come to love a man who never once asked her real name until she offered it herself. She wrote that she wanted to send for her daughter, that she almost did, twice, but that every time she came close, the fear that had driven her into these woods in the first place rose up and stopped her hand. She wrote, "I told myself I would go back for her when it was safe. I told myself this for 6 years. By then she had grown up believing I had simply left. I don't know how to undo that kind of harm with an explanation. I only know that if anyone ever finds this, it means I am no longer here to try, and I would rather my granddaughter, or whoever comes after her, know the truth than know nothing at all." Esther read the word granddaughter and had to set the letter down on the cot beside her, because the arithmetic was suddenly very simple. The daughter left with an aunt was Esther's own mother. The woman who never came back for her was Esther's grandmother. And the name stenciled on the footlocker was not a coincidence or an homage. It was the same name, passed down through 2 generations of women who had each, in their own way, been left somewhere and told to wait. Esther thought of her mother crying in the driveway 3 weeks ago, apologizing without intervening, and she understood, with a grief that felt both old and entirely new, that she had just watched her mother repeat, in a smaller and gentler way, the exact shape of abandonment that had once been done to her. Neither woman had ever spoken of it. Neither woman, perhaps, had ever fully understood it either. If you've ever discovered something about your own family that reframed a memory you thought you already understood, let us know in the comments, because Esther was about to learn that the hardest part of this discovery wasn't the past. It was deciding what to do with her mother now that she knew it. Esther didn't drive home that week, though she thought about it more than once, her hand hovering over her phone at 2 in the morning with her mother's number already dialed. Each time, she put the phone down, not out of anger, but because she understood now that this wasn't a truth to deliver over a call, not something to hand her mother the way it had been handed to her, alone, in the dark, with no one to hold the weight of it alongside her. Instead, she spent 3 days making the cabin livable, patching the roof with tarps from the hardware store in the nearest town, hauling water, sleeping better than she had in months despite the discomfort, because for the first time in her adult life she was somewhere that felt like it belonged to her, rather than something she was borrowing, until someone decided to take it back. On the 4th day she found the ranger's grave, a modest stone in a small forestry cemetery 20 minutes down the mountain. William Calloway. Dates confirming he'd lived another 11 years past the fire. Long enough, she hoped, to have had some peace in them. There was no second name beside his, no wife listed, which told her that whatever the two of them had built together, it had never been made official in any way the county recorded, only in a logbook and a letter meant for someone not yet born. She drove home the following weekend, not to stay, only to talk. Her mother opened the door, already crying, before Esther had said a single word, and Esther realized later that some part of her mother must have been waiting 30 years for a conversation neither of them had the language to start. They sat at the kitchen table until it grew dark outside, Esther reading the letter aloud in pieces, her mother's face moving through something too complicated to name, grief and anger and a strange, reluctant relief. The relief of finally understanding a wound instead of simply carrying it. Esther didn't ask her mother to forgive a woman neither of them had really known. She only asked her to consider that leaving and being taken from were sometimes harder to tell apart than people wanted to believe, and that maybe the softest thing they could do now was refuse to let the pattern travel any further than it already had. Her mother didn't say much back, but 2 weeks later, she showed up at the cabin unannounced, with a folding chair and a thermos of coffee, and sat on the porch step while Esther worked on the roof, and that, more than any speech, felt like the beginning of an answer. Esther kept the footlocker exactly where she'd found it, empty now. The logbook and letter moved somewhere safer, but the locker itself stayed in the corner of the cabin as a kind of marker, proof that a family could lose its own story for decades and still, somehow, find its way back to the person who needed to read it. She didn't know yet what she would do with the cabin long term, whether she'd stay through the winter or simply visit, but she knew she wouldn't sell it, and she knew, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she wasn't waiting for anyone's permission to belong somewhere. If this story moved you, we'd love for you to stick around for more, and we'll see you in the next one.